I open the notebook and see a single white page staring back at me. It's blank, like my future. My pen trembles in my hand, and for the first time in my life, I don't know if I have anything left to say. Or maybe I have too much. I exhale, feel the slow thud in my chest, feel how my heart's beating like it's trying to punch its way out. Then I press the pen down. The page soaks up the first drop of ink, and I imagine it as a single tiny wound. I remember the first moment I knew something was wrong. It was 3 weeks ago, though it feels like years. Her phone lay on the table. That old harmless device that used to buzz with appointments and calls from my wife's design clients. But that day, it was silent. For too long. I don't know why that silence called to me. Maybe I'd caught the tension on her face an hour earlier, the way she cringed when the phone vibrated in her purse and quickly turned away so I wouldn't see the screen. Maybe I'm just paranoid. But I picked it up, feeling like a trespasser in my own home. My fingers were shaking, and I couldn't decide if I was going to check or just hold it, maybe put it down and pretend none of this was happening. Then my thumb slid across the screen, and her messages opened. I saw words. I saw phrases. I saw something that punched me right in the gut. It wasn't a single line, not one confessional sentence. It was more insidious, spread over days, weeks, who knows how long. His name, Mike, appeared again and again, followed by half-teasing, half-burning lines that made my stomach churn. I read about her meeting him, about shared touches, about how exciting it was to feel alive. I read about her frustration with me. That was the biggest blow. Her dissatisfaction, her hidden longing. I told myself to stop, but I couldn't. I read all of it. Then I put her phone down so carefully, I might as well have been handling a bomb. And in that instant, a bomb did go off inside me. That was the first explosion. A silent quake, cracking the foundation of everything I thought I knew. But I gave nothing away. I placed the phone exactly where it had been and walked out. I'm not sure if I was breathing or if my heart had just turned to stone. I confronted her that evening, in my own way, quietly, with a single question that was more like a statement. I said, "You're seeing someone else." She didn't answer immediately, just looked at me, startled, with those wide eyes. Then she forced a small laugh, as if I'd told an off-color joke. My face felt stiff, and I repeated, "You're seeing someone else." She got angry, defensive. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Why would you even say that?" I couldn't prove anything without revealing that I'd snooped in her phone. So I just stared back. After a full minute of silence, I turned away and walked into the garage, slamming the door behind me. Sometimes I think the door's slam still echoes in our house, a permanent vibration in the walls. She didn't try to follow, didn't try to explain. That quiet admission told me all I needed to know. The next day, I tried to keep the routine. Went to work, forced myself to smile at colleagues, avoided any real conversation. My phone would buzz from time to time. Boss checking in, clients wanting updates. But I ignored it. My mind was fixed on the messages I'd read. How she described the thrill of meeting him in some discreet place. How she felt lighter and free. A single line burned into my head. "He understands me better than anyone ever has." Over and over, that line repeated in my thoughts, like a demon chanting in my ear. That same night, I stepped into the living room when she wasn't around and placed a small mirror on the coffee table. Across the glass, in bold black letters, I'd written, "You lie in reflection." Don't ask me why I did it. It felt dramatic, maybe childish, but it was also an urge I couldn't ignore. I wanted her to see herself, to face the fact that every time she looked in the mirror, she was seeing someone who had betrayed me, someone who was lying. It was a wordless confrontation. She discovered it in the morning. I was standing in the doorway, watching her reaction. She froze at the sight, her face crumpling into anger and confusion, and something that might have been guilt, or maybe just fury at me for crossing that line. I don't know. That same day, I saw him for the first time. I recognized him before I even knew his name. The way he lingered on the street outside our house in a car that was too sleek for a casual visitor. The way he glanced toward our front door, with a mixture of hesitation and eagerness, told me everything. He was younger than me, a bit leaner, with this relaxed posture that screamed, "I'm not worried about consequences." I watched from the window, hidden by the drapes, my fists clenched. Part of me wanted to storm out and confront him right there. But my arms felt too heavy, my legs glued in place. I just watched, silent, as my wife opened the door, stepped out, and walked toward his car. She paused, turning her head as if scanning the windows. I ducked back. When I looked out again, she was climbing into his passenger seat, and the car pulled away slowly. I spent the next 2 hours pacing the house like a caged animal. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it through the walls. A sick sense of curiosity and dread filled me. Where did they go? A motel? A secluded diner? Maybe his apartment? I kept picturing them together, imagining the worst. My mind conjured up images of him pressing her against a wall, her hair falling across her face, their lips meeting in some ferocious dance that used to be mine. My stomach twisted. I told myself I was done, that I was leaving, or that I was going to call her parents, or call a lawyer. But all I did was sink into the couch and bury my face in my hands. When she came home that evening, I was in the kitchen, opening and closing drawers without purpose. She walked in, set her keys down, acted as though nothing was amiss. But her cheeks were flushed, and I spotted a faint red mark on the side of her neck. I stared at it, felt a molten flood of rage rising inside me. She noticed my gaze and instantly raised her hand to cover it. "It's just, I brushed against something," she said, voice shaky. I'd almost laughed. Instead, I said nothing. My silence must have unnerved her, because she started talking too fast, making excuses, something about meeting a friend for coffee, about looking at a potential design project. Her words blurred. I only remember my own voice eventually cutting in. "Liz," I said, "I saw him pick you up." Her lips pressed together until they whitened. Then she flared up. "Why are you spying on me? Don't you trust me at all?" She spat, voice thick with anger and something like desperation. "Trust?" I snarled back, my voice rising in a way I'd barely recognized. "You want to talk to me about trust now?" We both shouted at once, words tumbling over each other. "Why do you keep accusing me? Where the hell were you?" "It's none of your business. You're my wife. It's my business." We yelled so loudly the sound echoed off the kitchen walls. Eventually, she ran upstairs, slamming the door behind her. I was left standing in the kitchen, my breaths ragged. My throat felt scratched raw from a single outburst. That night, lying in bed next to her, was torture. I heard her breathing, soft and measured, and I wondered if she was actually asleep or just pretending. My own eyes stayed open, pinned to the dark ceiling, while the same images replayed in my mind. At some point, I got up and paced around the house again. I ended up in front of that mirror with the inscription. Under the dim hallway light, the words looked like a wound carved into the glass. The next day, I discovered she had blocked her phone with a new password. A small, trivial barrier, but it spoke volumes. She'd closed off the last path I had to the truth. I'd worked a half day in the office, then came home early to an empty house. I looked around, noticing how each room had traces of her presence, from the color scheme she'd chosen to the little design flourishes. Everything looked perfect and hollow. In our bedroom, I found an envelope with her sketches for a new interior project. Pages of color palettes, furniture outlines, mood boards. In one corner, she'd doodled a heart. Inside that heart, an initial M. I stared at it for a long time. I remember thinking, this is real. I can't ignore it. She's in love with someone else, or at least infatuated. The strangest wave of calm washed over me, the kind you feel when your worst suspicions are finally confirmed. I sat on the edge of the bed, pressed the envelope to my forehead, and just stayed there, breathing in and out. The next part of the story is the hardest, because I wanted to see it. I needed to see it, the way a man picks at a scab even though it hurts. I followed her that weekend. She said she was heading to a design exposition downtown. She left dressed in a casual blouse, tight jeans that I hadn't seen her wear for a while, and that faintly floral perfume that once drove me crazy. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and walking out to the car. My heart pounded, but my mind felt numb. I found them together, a small motel on the outskirts of the city. Her car was there, parked right beside a silver sedan, presumably his. I pulled up across the street, out of sight, and watched. At first, nothing happened. The curtains of one second-story window were closed. The sign outside said VACA in flickering neon. Every second felt like it stretched into an hour. I told myself to drive away. But I couldn't. I got out of the car, approached the building with a mixture of dread and a twisted sense of purpose. I walked up the stairs, every footstep echoing. I had no plan, no clue what I was doing. I just knew that if I didn't confirm it with my own eyes, I'd never stop wondering. It took me a moment to figure out which door was theirs. I heard muffled laughter, then soft moans. I froze, feeling my hands shaking. An older couple walked past me in the hallway, giving me a puzzled look. But I didn't move. I pressed my ear to the door, and there it was, a sound I recognized all too well. Her voice, breathy and urgent, the voice she used to make in our own bed. I felt something tear inside me, a ripping sensation in my chest that spread all the way to my fingertips. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay silent. Through the thin door, I heard them. Her words were a blur of gasps, mixed with his deep murmurs, punctuated by the shifting of sheets. Every faint sound stabbed me in the gut. Each subtle thump of a headboard or the rustling of clothing turned me inside out. I felt nauseous and furious, and heartbreakingly small. My feet wanted to kick that door down. My fists wanted to break through the plywood. But I just stood there, shaking, tears burning the corners of my eyes. Eventually, a wave of bitterness turned my stomach, and I stumbled back, leaning against the hallway's peeling wallpaper. I couldn't stay. I fled down the stairs and out into the parking lot, cold sweat running down my back. In the car, my head spun. My breathing sounded like an engine on the verge of stalling. I had no illusions now. This was no mild flirtation. They were sleeping together, plain and simple, and I had just listened to it, pinned to that door like some pathetic voyeur. I banged my forehead against the steering wheel, letting out a ragged groan. Then, with trembling hands, I started the engine and drove away, not even sure where I was heading. I ended up at a bar on the other side of town, a dinky place that smelled of old liquor and stale regrets. I must have sat there for hours, nursing a whiskey, ignoring the curious glances of the bartender. I thought about calling a friend, but all my friends were more like acquaintances, and none of them were close enough to handle what I needed to spill. So I sat there, alone, replaying the humiliating soundtrack of my wife's betrayal in my mind. When I finally left, the sun was setting, and I realized I had at least one decision to make: how to confront her again. Back home, she was already there, waiting in the living room, arms folded tight. The moment she saw me, she started in. "Where were you?" she demanded, voice high-pitched. "You've been gone all day and you want to know where I was." I cut her off, laughing a bitter, strangled laugh. "I was at the motel, Liz, the one on Highway 6. Where you go with him." Her face went pale as chalk, and she took a step back. "Don't," she pleaded, voice wavering. "You don't understand." But that's when I felt something inside me snap. I raised my voice, so sharp it startled even me. "I heard you," I said, pointing a shaking finger at her. "I heard everything through that goddamn door." Her eyes darted away. She couldn't face me. "Jack, listen," she started, but her words were swallowed by the ragged rush of my anger. "Why him?" I snarled, my throat tight. "What do you get from him that you can't get from me?" she stammered, stepping forward, tears welling up, a twisted mixture of remorse and frustration on her face. We've been drifting apart," she said, voice cracking. "He made me feel." "Feel what?" I barked. "Alive? Desired? Needed?" She flinched. "Yes," she whispered, half choking on the word. "And you just left me here, like an afterthought." My chest rose and fell with labored breaths. She tried to touch my arm, but I yanked it away. The next moments were a burst of raw screaming. From both of us. I roared about betrayal, about vows, about how she could do this to me. She yelled back about how I never listened, about how I was distant, about how I cared more for my job than for her feelings. Her voice was ragged, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mine was harsh, tears burning in my eyes but refusing to fall. The confrontation ended with her sobbing, sinking into the couch, face in her hands, while I stood there, fists clenched, breathing like I'd run a marathon. After a beat, I turned on my heel and walked out. I left her there, gasping for air between sobs. I didn't comfort her, didn't stay to talk. I stormed upstairs, locked myself in our bedroom, and collapsed onto the bed. The pillow still smelled faintly of her perfume, and that just fueled my rage. I lay awake for hours, feeling the weight of betrayal throbbing in my chest. The days that followed were a haze of tension and unspoken words. At work, I couldn't focus. My boss kept pulling me into meetings I barely registered. I started ignoring my phone, ignoring emails. At home, we circled each other like wary animals. She'd sleep in the guest room or come home late, avoiding me. Sometimes I heard her on the phone, speaking in a low voice, and I knew she was talking to him. Each time, I felt a fresh stab of pain, but I swallowed it. My feelings started to curdle into something darker. Eventually, I decided that if she wouldn't stop, if she insisted on continuing this affair, I'd make sure he felt the consequences. I thought, she can't claim ignorance now. She knows I know. And yet she keeps going. Fine. Let him see what it's like to cross me. I began drafting a letter in my mind. An angry, venomous thing I planned to send him. I wanted him to know he was sleeping with someone's wife, that he was messing with a man who wasn't about to roll over and disappear. I sat down at my computer one night, the house quiet. She was out again, presumably with him. My hands hovered over the keyboard, then started typing. The words spewed out. "You slept with her. Now you're sleeping with the enemy." My anger pulsed in every keystroke. I threatened him, called him every name I could muster in the moment. I told him he was about to learn how dangerous it was to toy with another man's marriage. My voice in that letter was raw, trembling with rage and a flicker of desperation. I saved it, read it over. It was vicious, and that made me feel good, or at least less powerless. Then I noticed a half-reflection in the dark monitor, my own face twisted into a snarl. It startled me. I realized how far I was sliding into hate, how the bitterness was poisoning me from within. And yet, I couldn't stop. I decided I'd post it on social media, tag him if I could find his profile. Make it public. Make it humiliating. The moment I hit post, adrenaline surged in me like a drug. My hands quivered, my heart hammered. I waited, expecting the screen to blow up with reactions. Nothing happened at first. Then the door clicked downstairs. She was back, and I heard her footsteps approach the study. She stepped in, eyes rimmed with sadness. "We need to talk," she said quietly. I stared at her, something cold and hollow in my eyes. "It's too late for talking," I replied, voice low. But she insisted, so we ended up in the living room again. She told me she hadn't planned to fall in love, or whatever it was, with him. It just happened. She swore she never wanted to hurt me, that she'd been confused, that she felt lonely and underappreciated. I didn't bother to argue. I just listened, arms folded. She realized I was done trying to empathize. That's when she noticed the open laptop and recognized the look on my face. Something in her expression shifted. "Jack," she said slowly, "what did you do?" Her voice was shaky, almost frightened. I didn't answer. Instead, I said, "Check your phone. You'll see soon enough." She opened her phone, scrolled, found what I had posted. A strangled gasp escaped her throat. "You posted this." Her hands clutched the device like it was on fire. "How could you?" "How could I?" I snapped back, voice rising again. "You've been lying to me for months. You've been giving yourself to another man, my wife. Now you want me to be polite." She shook her head, tears brimming. "Jack, this is going to ruin us. You can't just ruin us." I let out a harsh laugh. "We're already ruined, Liz. Don't pretend there's anything left to save." She buried her face in her palms, her sobs muffled by trembling fingers. I felt a pang of guilt then, seeing her so broken, but I crushed it. I told myself she deserved this. She brought it on herself. The rancor in my chest felt like a shield I needed to survive. Word spread quickly among our mutual acquaintances. I started getting calls, texts from friends asking if I was okay, if the post was real. My sister left me a voicemail, frantic with concern. Meanwhile, Liz locked herself in the guest room, ignoring the phone that kept lighting up with messages from her coworkers, her family. She wouldn't come out. I could hear her crying through the door. I never knew how much I could hate that sound, how it twisted me into a million conflicting emotions. But the one call I was anticipating never came. Mike's. Eventually, I guess, he must have seen the post. Maybe he realized the storm heading his way. One night, the phone finally rang. An unknown number I just knew had to be him. I picked up, said nothing. "Jack." The voice was unsure, quiet. "It's Mike. I need to talk to you." My hand clenched on the phone. I stepped into the hallway, out of earshot from Liz. "You've got a lot of nerve calling me," I said. He breathed heavily on the other end. "I get it, you're angry," he started, but I cut him off. "Angry doesn't even begin to describe it," I snarled. "You stepped into my marriage like it was your personal playground. Do you have any idea?" He tried to speak. I heard a quiver in his voice, but also a certain boldness that fueled my fury. "She was unhappy," he said. "She came to me, said you never paid attention." I let out a furious roar, making him pause. "You think that justifies this?" I snapped. "You think you're some hero rescuing a damsel in distress." We went back and forth, yelling over each other. Our words were heated, raw, each sentence like a knife. He started telling me how Liz deserved happiness, how I pushed her away. I told him to stay the hell out of my life. Finally, I shouted, "If you ever come near my house again, I swear to God," and hung up, slamming the phone down so hard it nearly broke. I was shaking afterwards, feeling more hollow than before. Revenge wasn't satisfying. It tasted like ash in my mouth. The next day, I woke to see Liz quietly packing a suitcase. She wasn't even crying anymore, just methodically folding clothes. My voice barely emerged from my throat. "Where are you going?" She looked at me, eyes raw and empty. "I can't stay here, Jack. Not like this." I stood by the doorway, arms limp at my sides. "You're leaving me." She gave a sad nod. "At least for a while. My parents said I could stay with them. I need to think. Everything is collapsing, and I need space." I couldn't bring myself to beg her to stay. Part of me wanted to, but the bigger part was drowning in pride and anger. So I just stood there, silent, while she zipped up her suitcase. Right before she left, she paused by the mirror I'd defaced with the words, "You lie in reflection." She looked into it for a moment, eyes flicking over the inscription. I watched as a tremor went through her, but her face remained impassive. Then she turned and walked out the door. That night, the house felt immense and cold. I roamed from room to room, restless and haunted by memories. I ended up in the bedroom, alone in the dark, staring at the bed we used to share. My chest felt unbearably tight, like I was trapped under a boulder. I tried to lie down, but the sheets smelled like her. I couldn't breathe. I got up, tore the sheets off, balled them up, and threw them into the closet. My heart was pounding so hard, it hurt. Days bled into each other. Liz was gone. I called out sick from work, ignoring the mounting emails. The house grew stale and silent. Sometimes I imagined I heard her footsteps in the hall. Sometimes I still expected to see her come around the corner with a tired smile. But she never did. I found myself flipping through old photos of us. Vacations, anniversaries, birthdays. Every picture told a story of a different time. A time when we looked at each other with trust and warmth. I thought revenge would make me feel powerful, like I was taking control. But all it did was hollow me out further. I pictured him, Mike, reading my post, dealing with the fallout. I pictured her, trying to piece together her life at her parents' house. And here I was, alone in the wreckage, with that same blank notebook in front of me, not sure what to write or how to move on. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing there, suitcase in hand, eyes puffy. She stepped inside without waiting for me to invite her. I braced myself, my chest clenching. "I'm not here to beg," she said quietly. "I just need to talk." We sat in the living room again, on opposite ends of the couch. I stared at my hands, noticing how the knuckles looked whiter than usual. I expected her to say she was leaving for good, wanted a divorce. But she surprised me. "I ended things with him," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me. It's over. It was wrong. I was reckless. And you were right. I betrayed you." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry." A heavy silence fell between us. My throat felt tight. "So, why are you here?" I finally asked, my voice raw. She shifted, eyes shiny with tears that wouldn't fall. "Because I had nowhere else to go," she admitted. "Because I don't want to be at my parents' place forever. And because I don't want to lose everything." She looked at me, but I couldn't read her expression fully. "I know it's probably too late," she said. "But if there's any chance, I'd like to try to fix this, or at least fix something." I thought about how much I'd wanted her to say those words a week ago. Now they felt almost meaningless, drowned by all the hurt. The urge to lash out again rose in my chest, to tell her it was too late, to push her away. But I couldn't speak for a moment. My eyes burned as I stared at the floor. "I don't trust you anymore," I finally said, voice cracking. "I don't even know who you are." She swallowed, tears rolling down her cheeks silently. "I don't know who I am either," she whispered. We talked for hours, though talked might be too generous a term. We circled around accusations, confessions, regrets. I asked her why she never told me she felt so alone. She said she tried, but I was always too consumed with work or my own thoughts. We both shouted at times, apologized at times, fell into abrupt silences that pressed down on us like a suffocating blanket. By the end of it, we were emotionally spent. She asked if she could sleep in the guest room tonight. I shrugged, unable to form a coherent answer, and watched her carry her suitcase upstairs. That night I lay awake again, thinking about how everything in my life was unraveling. I wanted to break something, to shout at the universe. But I just lay there, my chest hurting with each breath. Days passed. We lived under the same roof, tiptoeing around each other. She tried to be gentle, to give me space, and I tried not to drown in my bitterness. I noticed she'd stopped texting him, at least as far as I could tell. One afternoon, I found her weeping in the kitchen, her phone on the table. She looked up when I came in, tears staining her cheeks. "He won't leave me alone," she said in a small voice. "He's begging me to come back." A fresh surge of anger rose in me. "Are you going?" I asked, cold as ice. She shook her head vehemently. "No, I told him we're done. But he keeps calling." I looked at the phone, saw his name on the missed calls. A part of me wanted to grab that phone and hurl it through the window. Instead, I picked it up, pressed the callback, and when he answered, I spoke. Stay away from her. Then I hung up. For the first time in ages, I saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. Even so, relief doesn't erase betrayal. She kept to the guest room. I slept in our bed, though it felt empty and cold. We'd speak in low voices at times, trying to unravel the threads of resentment. Sometimes it ended with me shouting or with her crying. Sometimes we just sat in silence, letting the bitterness hover like a storm cloud. I wasn't sure if we were rebuilding or just living in denial. Then came the moment that changed everything again. I was at home, sorting through old boxes in the garage, trying to distract my mind. The phone rang, and it was the hospital. They told me that my wife had collapsed at work from a severe migraine and had been rushed in. My anger evaporated in an instant, replaced by cold fear. I raced to the hospital, found her lying on a bed, pale as a sheet, an IV in her arm. She looked fragile, vulnerable in a hospital gown that dwarfed her. As soon as she saw me, she tried to smile, but tears welled up. All my pent-up rage turned into a swirl of concern. I sat by her side, took her hand. What happened? I asked, voice shaking. She winced. It was just a migraine that wouldn't stop, she said. I got dizzy, nearly fainted. We fell silent. The monitors beeped softly in the background. After a while she whispered, I'm sorry, Jack. The tears fell from her eyes onto the pillow. I did this. I let it get so bad. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel something other than fury. My chest clenched, and I found myself blinking back tears. Don't talk, I said softly, stroking her hair. Just rest. She squeezed my hand, and we stayed like that. In that quiet hospital room, I felt the last few months press down on me with staggering force. I realized I didn't want her gone. I realized that despite everything, she was still the woman I once loved, maybe still loved. The question was, could we survive this? She came home 2 days later, still weak, but determined. I hovered around, unsure how to act. She noticed my awkwardness and forced a small smile. You can ask. Part of me wanted to walk away and never look back. But I stayed in the chair by her bedside that night, watching her sleep, thinking about how we got here, how I posted that letter out of rage, how I tried to tear down her world and mine in the process. We both shredded our marriage with careless, vicious hands. We're not okay. Not by a long shot. But the next morning, I found a second chance in my own notebook. I opened it to that same first blank page, now filled with scribbles of anger and sorrow, random words that hardly made sense. I flipped to a fresh sheet. The emptiness there didn't feel as devastating as before. This time, it felt like a space to rebuild. I wrote the date on top, then wrote a single sentence. I am still here. She took a hesitant step into my study, watched me write. Jack, she began, voice tentative. I looked up, saw in her eyes the same exhaustion and heartbreak that weighed on me. We held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then I offered her the chair beside me. She sat down. We didn't speak, just let the silence settle. That was the day we started counseling. I made the call. It didn't feel like forgiveness. God, no, but it felt like a step away from destruction. She agreed, tears bright in her eyes. Our first session was brutal, both of us forced to talk about things we'd kept locked away for years. I spoke about feeling taken for granted, about feeling replaced. She spoke about isolation and the desperate need to be heard. We shouted, we cried, we glared at each other, and at times we clung to each other's words like a lifeline. The counselor didn't promise miracles, but gave us tools to communicate without tearing each other apart. At home, the old anger still lurked in corners. Sometimes a single casual comment would spark a flare-up, and we'd have to step back, breathe, try again. The bed felt less like a battlefield, though she still spent most nights in the guest room until we were sure we wanted to share that space again. We moved slowly, painfully. One afternoon, I got a message from him. Mike. A simple line. I won't contact her again. I'm sorry. Take care of her. It felt like a final admission of defeat on his part. It also felt like salt in a wound, a reminder of what she'd done. But I read it, then deleted it, refusing to let him haunt me anymore. I'm not saying we found a magical closure. That night, I dreamed of her in that motel room, his hands on her body. I woke up drenched in sweat, my breath ragged. She heard me stirring, came in, found me trembling at the edge of the bed. Without a word, she sat next to me, placed a hand on my back. My first instinct was to pull away, but I didn't. I let her touch me, let her try to soothe the war inside my head. We sat like that until dawn streaked the window with pale light. A few days later, we took down that mirror with a black inscription. We carried it out to the garage. She ran her fingers over the words, "You lie in reflection," and sighed. "We can't pretend this never happened," she said quietly. "But I'm tired of looking at this every day." I nodded. We placed it face down in a corner, a silent memorial to the havoc we'd wrought. Now, as I write these final lines in my notebook, my heart feels heavy and uncertain. She's here in the next room, sorting through old design portfolios. We're living in a shaky truce, maybe on a fragile path to something else. Sometimes we talk about the future, sometimes we just ignore it. We're both changed people, hollowed out, maybe stronger in some twisted way. I can't say I've forgiven her. I can't say I trust her fully yet. But I'm still here, and she is too. My phone buzzes. A text from her. Want some coffee? She's just a few steps away, but maybe texting feels safer right now, less confrontational than face-to-face. I type back, "Sure." Then I close the notebook, and for the first time, the blank page doesn't terrify me. It's an opening, a chance to find myself again, or to lose myself all over. But at least I'm the one writing this story now. I head downstairs to join her. The air feels heavy still, thick with unspoken regrets. Yet there's a tiny current of hope. I can't tell if it's real or just a lull before another storm. But I'll take it, because maybe in the end, that's all we can do. Keep going, keep speaking, keep hurting, keep trying. Even if everything we once were is already gone, we can't bury ourselves alive with it. I can taste the bitterness in my mouth. I can feel the weight of every memory pressing against my ribs. But I'm breathing. I'm walking. I'm taking that coffee she hands me, wrapping my fingers around the cup like it's the only warm thing left in this cold house. I see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the same question echoing in mine. Where do we go from here? I don't have the answer, but at least I'm still standing. She's still here, at least for now. We're two battered souls in the wreckage of our marriage. The mirror is gone, but the cracks are still inside us. Maybe they'll always be there. Maybe they'll be a reminder of what we almost lost, what we did lose. I can't tell anymore. Yet, as I sip the coffee, there's an almost physical ache in my chest, a throbbing that reminds me I'm alive. And maybe, just maybe, I haven't completely given up on hope or on her. If that's foolishness, so be it. I've lived a lifetime in the last few weeks, and if I can survive that, I can survive another day, one day at a time. I can't even say goodbye to my old self properly, because I'm not sure what's left of him. Maybe I'll find out. Maybe I won't. But the next page in the notebook is waiting, and I'm the one holding the pen.